Hello and welcome to the CNBC Africa Special. I'm Arnold Segawa. We are at the Convention Center talking energy, more so the energy mix here in Rwanda, a country that has an installed capacity of just over 200 megawatts, but this is more than what is being consumed. The country is not comfortable as stakeholders and the private sector are meeting here today at the Energy Convention Forum to talk about means to see that this electrification is achieved to 100% by 2024. Joining me to talk about this particular conversation is Dr. Ivan Twiragishema, who is the CEO for Energy Development Partners here in Rwanda. He's also the CEO for the Ngali Holdings in Rwanda. Right next to him is Dr. Duse Foke, and right next to her is Mr. Patrick Mugawa. Many thanks for making time to speak to us. Dr. Ivan, let's just start off with you. The installed capacity in the country, many argue, yes, it is at a point where it is more being produced than is actually being consumed. Is there any move or even any cause for us to actually be talking about having more electricity?
We are saying we have more electricity, but on another side, it's not true, because we have more electricity for the existing transmission line, for the existing grid in the country. But all the people are not connected. So it means today, if we try to connect all the population in Rwanda, this production capacity of around 200 megawatt will not be sufficient at all. Mm-hmm. So that's the reason where renewable energy has to come in and help the country to connect more population without a need to invest into huge quantities of money, especially into transmission line.
Right. In fact, that's where I was just about to go, Dr. Dusek. An investment into transmission, as opposed to what much of Sub-Saharan Africa has been doing in the past, where you just generate electricity and forget about transmission. Is this an approach that maybe should be given more attention?
Well, taking up your line, what's important now is to get the rural area, to get villages connected to access to electricity, meaning, as you are doing, meaning promoting microgrid solutions, mini-grid solutions, off-grid solutions, and the technology for that is renewables, solar, there's hydro, micro hydro, and bigger hydro, but that goes on the grid. So these technologies, they enable countries nowadays much faster to electrify much beyond lightning needs. And so you do have a complete new society setup coming, enabling input of renewable energy in this fashion, enables also small business, bigger business. Then you have, we talked today a lot about special arrangement, power purchase arrangements, where you may have a grid-related industry already, but they need more, at least for peak power, for example. And then they would do a power purchase agreement with members of this association, with industry coming in the renewable world.
Right. Patrick, talk of solar. I mean, for the past decade, everyone has been going on about solar, but yet again, some still argue it is not as affordable as we might want it to be, as is maybe in the East, in parts of China, parts of India, where it is very affordable. What do you say to this?
I think it's the wrong perception that people have out there. When we look at what we have, what we are offering currently on the market, it's, I'll say, very affordable. Looking at the fact that now many players are offering prepaid energy or pay-as-you-go options, I think this gives more access and even options for the people to actually afford this energy.
Right. Now, we've been talking earlier on about some catastrophes, if I could say, that have happened in the past, and maybe making the case even more for renewables, like Patrick is going on about. Fast forward to where we are right now. Is this a time that maybe we saw more legislation pushing governments towards achieving more renewables in their energy mix? Ivan, Doctor.
I would give an example, first of all, on Rwanda, where we have since last year a renewable energy strategy, which is a strategy drafted involving also private sector. So we had to sit and bring to the table our concerns also as companies which are going to be involved in that exercise. So today you can't talk about energy mix without considering renewable energy for many reasons. If you consider thermal power, you will consume fuel. If you consider hydro, you will have an impact of the climate change on your production. But if you talk about solar, you will always have the sun shining. As long as it's there, you're producing electricity. So in any kind, today in the energy mix, even for countries having a huge amount of resources like oil, they need to consider renewable energy in the energy mix. You can't talk about now the future of energy without renewable energy.
But again, that's where the question comes in. For a continent like Africa that has vast hours of sunlight, what is honestly holding us back to take advantage of solar as it is? Patrick, I want to hear your views, and Dr. Duse.
I'll say I think one of the challenges was the right technology back in the days. But today, I mean, the technology is there. We have improved so much on the solar energy technology. And I think we are actually in the right direction. It's a matter of changing the perception of how what people think about solar energy from the past and where we are today.
Doctor, maybe if you could just top up on that.
I would underline also that, and you do not get a change if you do not have a good planning and the political will to change and to have targets, for example, as you have in Rwanda with your electrification targets, with your target for renewable energies, and under the targets, countries must define the policies. So support mechanisms which are needed. We talked about that. We can come back to that later. Financing is cost intensive. There are new models of financing. But what I from Europe as an onlooker, so to say, what I find fascinating is that your continent has shown you can do what we in old Europe cannot do that fast, or we do it differently. You can leapfrog. You already use, as you said, well, I come in with a package and we do pay as you go. We use the mobile phone for payments. This creates such a speed now that the discussion we are now having may not have been able 2 years ago even, or 3 years ago. So the rapidity in renewable deployment now, once there is a political willingness and people say, okay, we were used to having center power, big hydro dam, big oil using capacity. This is a mental shift, and sometimes they're interested also in why you do not use your brain that fast as you should, but it's getting there.
There's this school of thought that maybe the lifespan of some solar panels is not as long as some other sources of energy. Patrick, what do you say to some of these critics who table this thought?
I think that's the issue of awareness again that I wanted to touch on, and I'm actually glad that we're here with Ivan. We have been struggling. One of the challenges is the awareness of this whole energy and the wrong information that have been going around. Because when you look at the panel, for example, the panel we're currently offering has around 25 years. And I mean, 25 years without maintenance, without any issue, it's a long time in my opinion. In my view. So I think one of the issues we have been facing is the awareness and people comparing the information they have from the past to the current technology we have in place. But good enough, we have institutions like EPD pushing for awareness, government also pushing for it, for the awareness and pushing for the people to actually trust in this energy. So I think that issue is changing in Rwanda so fast, And we really looking forward to see a lot of changes and better distribution taking place.
Dr. Ivan, I think the most fascinating thing about the African Development Bank president right now, Dr. Kunumi Adesina, is prioritizing energy, at least from the time he came in as a president. And one of the things he's very keen on is, maybe topping up to what Patrick is saying, is off-grid solutions. Now, every time that we talk, that's the other thing that you're actually looking at. If yes, we have on-grid solutions, but off-grid. Working hand in hand with the likes of Mobisol and other players, how essential is it to achieve the grand goal of electrification, not only for Rwanda, but Sub-Saharan Africa?
I think I would bring to the table two things. First of all, touching on what Patrick was saying, the main concern in this sector, especially on the quality of solar products, is not on the side of private sector. It's on the side of the government, where they need to set standards for those products. If you arrive in an African country where you don't have any standards and there is no one checking or regulating the sector, for sure, we have, from China you can get different kind of products, and they are producing, it means they don't have all the same quality of products. So the standards needs to be set and put in place, and this is something very important. Then on another side, you were asking a question on
first of all, before the standards, definitely,
yes.
The role of off-grid solutions.
Yeah, the role of off-grid solution is something very important, but there is also a challenge on off-grid solution, especially in microgrid and mini-grid. In Rwanda, I talked about the involvement of private sector in the drafting of the rural electrification strategy. The biggest issue during that discussion was the country mapping, because you want it or don't want it, in the near future you will have a competition between the grid extension and the location where people has kept developing those off-grid. So the population will have an option to choose going on grid or keeping off-grid solutions. And imagine companies who invested in those solutions and waiting to have their return on investment in 5 years, and the grid arrived there in 2 years. So this was something very serious during the discussion, and we needed to do the country mapping to make sure that there are zones allocated for off-grid or mini-grid solutions. If you don't do that, you're gonna distort the market, because the country will keep extending the grid without considering the investment of private sector.
But now that creates another problem, because if at all, yes, the private sector is bringing so much to the table, and yes, the government is also doing what they can, and we are in the middle of the consumers. If he's not getting his return on investment because you've brought in the grid earlier or even later, let's say, well, that's good for him. But doesn't that create some kind of a fiasco in the grand scheme of things? How have maybe economies that are more developed in the OECD, how would you say they have done this? How have they addressed this particular one?
They do this. They also have made mistakes. So it's a difficult question. I would also say without planning, for example, in Europe you have even zoning where you put wind power. Most electricity from renewables in Europe is on grid. So there is a distribution system level, and we more talk there about, because we have a quite dense system of grids already from the past. We are there more talking about enabling the grid to live with flexibility, so we have more demand response issues there. We do not have your challenge almost nowhere in Europe, if I may say, of access to so it's a different issue. And I think the UN Millennium Goals, when they said we have a right, everybody has a right to access to electricity, was very important, and created exactly the situation here to say, okay, look at our country. We do have a certain quality of the grid, which has a certain outreach, but do we really want to spend that much money? And the minister said that rightly so, on full grid electrification of Rwanda, or don't we concentrate where we need this this more direct load link, let's say, from different loads, or where we just say the technologies, the batteries, the flexibility is so advanced, it is enough for a village, even with own industry, to live in under the radar of a bigger grid level.
Patrick, I'm really itching to hear what you think of this, because in the grand scheme of things, some might argue, okay, the government, the state is supposed to provide certain services, right? Certain goods. Yeah. And one would think, okay, electricity fits that bill, energy fits that bill. Mm-hmm. And if at all they do choose maybe change of government, like is synonymous with certain parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, if they do change the government and they decide, okay, now we're rolling out the grid to these parts, what does that mean for the private sector that has invested vastly into maybe some of these positions?
I'll say maybe things are a bit different when it comes to Rwanda and other countries. For example, we operate in East Africa, but I would say in Rwanda it's very, at least possible, to sit with the government and say we want to look at your roadmap in terms of grid expansion, so we know actually where you're heading and where we should focus. So with this information, at least you know that you have space to invest somewhere and to actually get some return on investment within a specific period of time. So that's again where EPD, because they advocate for the players on the market, so that at least we are also covered. But I think also touching to what she was commenting on, I think the setup is a bit different in terms of, let's say, demographic or geographic challenges when we talk about Africa and Europe. I mean, infrastructure-wise, even the way communities are set up, it's a bit different. But the good thing with renewable energy, actually, the existing or the current technology allows us to develop something that is specific to a particular community or particular setup. That's where, for example, the solar home system comes in, where someone actually have a standalone energy that actually they will end up owning at some point and stop depending on the government distribution of energy. You pay it and it's all yours. So you have it constantly, it's all yours, and actually you take it off your bill at some point. So I think we are heading the right direction.
Definitely. And talking of direction, I think from my little physics, from my O-level that I remember, energy can never be destroyed or created. And Dr. Ivan, I want to bring you in on this one, because one of the biggest problems with at least for the grid right now is, if at all, yes, the hydro dam does generate the power, puts it on the grid. There are times in the evening where everyone is going back home and the consumption is utterly outrageous and it's very high. Factor that in with the growing population. Rwanda is north of 3% population growth. How do we address this demand that is very cyclical?
Mainly, this brings in another point which is very important. When you are negotiating a power purchase agreement, you have a choice to negotiate and be in what we call baseload mode. Baseload mode means that when your power plant will be running, they will never ask you to shut down. It means you will be in the minimum needed, which is out of those changes, even from the morning up to evening. The consumption keep changing. The baseload mode, it means you are in that minimum required, yes, which never change. But it can't happen to all the independent power producers. They can't all fit into the baseload mode. So when you are not in the baseload mode, you will need at a certain time to switch off your production from the utility, because they say, okay, at that time we don't need your power production because of an issue. Because you can't keep feeding in the grid if there is no consumption on the other side. So for on-grid production, this is an issue, because sometimes you push to be in the baseload mode, but sometimes it's not possible because they're already on the saturation. So that's also an issue we need on the planning, especially on the government side.
Legislation, maybe, I don't know if you want to top on this particular conversation, because it's very complex.
Add something, because it's complex, but it's also very clear, and the explanation was clear. And the more, what we see in Europe, we have countries who have a high level of hydropower, like Scandinavian countries, Norway, Austria, Switzerland. And that is a nice balancing source, let's say that. In the more renewables we get on the grid with different qualities, like solar, more peaking during the day, obviously, wind more at different times, the more we have, like you would have with your neighbors all over, a growing different sorts of renewables, you will face a situation where the base load issue is no longer such an issue, because everybody is balancing the other one over
so the mix of energy actually
the mix of
balances
renewable
out.
energy.
Yeah.
And at one point we do face it, for example, in my country, in Germany, the base load is a little bit the enemy for further growth of renewables. They are blocking. They're blocking the grid, if you want, with their must-run quality, and then even though they are old and they are long written off, their interest to keep coal, for example, coal power plants growing, but the renewable energy sector would rather have them out of the system as fast as possible in order to have really this balancing world. And coming back to your wonderful hydropower, if it would be at that moment in Germany, we would negotiate with a hydropower plant to install pump storage. So that means the hydropower is not only giving its own power, but the hydropower pumps during the day the overflow of all other systems who are grid connected, obviously, pumps it up, and then when you have a need, the former solar energy is transformed into hydropower and given back to the grid.
It's very interesting getting the mix of energy right.
Yes.
And I don't know what you want to say about this, Patrick. I saw you itching to add to this, because getting the mix of energy right is definitely in along your line of work.
I think, for example, what Mobiso is currently focusing on is to provide the right solar home system, where actually a household depends on solar for powering all the appliances in the house. So we develop not only the system but also the appliances that goes with it. It's true, it's very good to have that mix, because in some areas a solar home system won't be enough for business reasons, buildings, in terms of institutions and so on. But as a private sector and coming from a company that is doing the right thing, I'd like to stay focused on the solar home system.
Right. Before we go for the break, I remember reading an article sometime, and they made it very clear that one of the biggest challenges that solar is facing right now is the installed infrastructure in terms of the grid might not be able to accommodate other mixes of energy. Now, I don't know how true this is. I think I'm in the right hands here to listen to the three of you, what you have to say about this. Whether or not adding solar, thermal, and other mixes of energy together with hydro can be achieved in certain parts of the world if your grid in the first place was traditionally maybe hydro to start with. Dr. Ivan, I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Now, it's coming back to the question you asked previously. In your energy mix, the role of solar in your energy mix has to be like between 10 and 20% on the overall, because of that issue of changes. Solar you produce only during the day. So it means if, for example, on your energy mix, you rely more than 40% on your solar, and you don't have a battery backup to store that electricity, it means during the day you will produce too much, and nighttime you will not have something to compensate until you develop your demand on a regular basis. So that's the main challenge of solar. But if we find a solution to store that electricity at a cheaper cost, because power storage exists already, but still the technology was expensive. But if we find cheap way of storing that electricity from solar, then the issue of solar will no longer be a concern, because you will be able to produce, store some electricity, and release that electricity during the night. So that's the main issue.
You've actually touched on a very pertinent point, which is the cost of storage. Now, we know futuristic people like Elon Musk talking about Tesla and the electric cars and SpaceX. But again, when you're talking about storage, the cost of storing the energy, wouldn't one argue that that can actually set up maybe another hydro dam that is like 10 megawatts? I want to definitely, Dr. Toos, I don't know what you say to this.
In storage terms, the business models are really increasing more and more viable. For example, you do have mining, and we have it in Europe as well, and we do have now, and the mines are this big underground often, and we use now the underground, it's so-called cavern storage. So you press their energy via compressed air into it, and we have with more, for example, in offshore wind, we have now more and more coming methanization of wind power, and we do have a gas grid, for example, in Europe, and we push the methanized wind electricity into this gas and keep it there. The gas grid will become one of the big storage options.
There's nothing more fascinating than going to the rural side and the countryside, should I say, and you see some of these families that have finally gotten maybe a solar panel, and they're changing lives. Some ladies tell you that now they can cook in the night, or the children can do their homework at night. Tell me, how essential is it for you to see some of these life-changing stories?
I'm really glad that you used the right word, changing lives of many. I mean, it's quite an awesome experience to see such thing, because actually not only you're giving people access to energy, but you opening up and changing their lives for better and for good, because actually now they have access to information. Now owning a TV, it's not an impossible dream, but actually a realistic one, because now they can plug on somewhere a TV and follow the news later on.
Patrick, and the team, allow me to just put a pause on this. Let's go for a short break. After the break, we'll be talking about energy and financing in the grand scheme of things. Where is the financing coming from, at least for Rwanda and also much of Sub-Saharan Africa? Welcome back to this CNBC Africa special. Me, Arnold Sagawa. We are at the Convention Center in Kigali, Rwanda, to be more precise, talking energy and the energy mix, making it a renewable energy, if I am to be more precise. Before we left off, many items that we had touched, the mix of energy, getting it right. I got a lesson in electricity and baseload mode. But I want to talk financing, because if you're seeing some countries like I think Nigeria is the best example for Sub-Saharan Africa. This is a country that is by far, well, by GDP figures, it is up there with South Africa on the continent, and it is always growing well. The oil, well, besides the oil crumble just last year, the commodities slump. But again, you're seeing a lot of load shedding. Where are we getting it wrong in some of these countries? I want to address this on a macro level, at least for Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Ivan.
For me, I think it's mainly an issue of planning, more an issue of planning than even the financing, because the oil they have available on the electricity side is the weakness they have, because they didn't develop transmission line in the country. And that's the reason why you find people having their own generator home, and they use those generators.
That's a common practice, yeah?
Yes, it's a common practice, and it's noisy. And the reason is they have means, they produce their own oil, and they are consuming oil in generators, and they didn't develop the transmission line. So that's, for me, mainly an issue of planning more than an issue of financing, because they have access to finance, and they can even finance it from their own budget.
Dr. Daughter, one question that comes to mind here is blended finance. The role of maybe having the private sector working hand in hand, PPPs ultimately, is it the best way to mitigate the problem that we have when it comes to financing, when it comes to energy?
Yes, it definitely is, but I cannot say that there are no problems on that score in Northern Africa. You have often countries which have a very strong national champion, and where even access to doing renewable energy business is very limited. And for the small and medium-sized business, having access to finance, our subject today, is not easy either. So I would not say that you are that there is a paradise, by far not. And there you could also again distinguish between countries who have own mineral resources and some who have no. And the mineral resources are sometimes also, in my personal view, making the country and society a bit addicted to it. And they don't look beyond, or what they should do. And I cannot add more poignant examples than you just did.
Patrick, there's another school of thought that argues that off-grid energy and electricity is a bit, or should I say even more expensive than electricity that is produced on-grid. And doesn't this put more pressure on people on the countryside who are actually usually the ones who, at least for Rwanda, are the ones who are being addressed by this particular solar panels and off-grid solutions? To
some extent, yes, and to another side, no, because I think it depends on how you look, which angle you want to look at this. We really are passionate and being driven by the freedom someone will get after paying off a system, a solar home system. This will allow you to be dependent for actually the electricity bill and actually have more option and an opportunity to invest your money in something else. So when you look at it, it's expensive for 3 years. That's, for example, what Mobiso is offering. So we finance our customers' solar home system, and we give you an opportunity to pay it out through 3 years. And then after that 3 years, the power is yours. You monitor, you use it the way you want it. The bill is off from your long monthly pay list. So I think it depends. I have to agree on one side, because if you want to pay something off within a short time of period, of course it's a bit expensive. But when we say expensive, what do you compare it with? Because you're comparing with a lifetime bill. See, so this is where the difference comes in, and yeah, it would be good. This is the awareness actually that we also need, that I keep insisting on, which is what we are getting, at least in Rwanda, good for us, and we hope to see it in also different countries.
I want to add something. When you say renewable energy is more expensive for people in the rural area, we did a study on that. It's not true, because if they run a kerosene lamp, or they use candles for lighting home, for the same time they run a solar lamp when they have it, it's more expensive for them for using kerosene lamps and candles than using solar lamps. But where is the problem? It's more expensive for kerosene, and they're getting a bad quality of light because they can't work on it and it's bad. But the miracle is on electricity lights, because someone who has already electricity light, he will prefer to eat once a day and keep the light home evening.
In the grand scheme of things, if we are to quantify if someone is on-grid and the other is off-grid with a solar solution, that is the question that I want to bring to you now.
Yes, if someone is on-grid, for sure, the cost will be a little bit lower than someone who is on renewable energy, on off-grid. That's normal, because the cost taken by the government for bringing the grid up to the population is not taken into the finance system. When you bring enough, if we had to put that cost of the government into a financial model, even on-grid will be more expensive than renewable energy.
But shouldn't we be getting more support from the government to the likes of Patrick, to the likes of Mobisol, to make sure that even that cost that the end user in the rural areas is facing is actually also a thing of the past?
Actually, the government and private sector can sit together and actually have a collaboration around this. It's a great idea, and it's among the ideas that actually in Rwanda we're trying to push. We were discussing about it earlier on the panel, and we hope to see something coming out of this.
Dr. Daughter, I want to bring you in on support mechanisms, something that you did hint on earlier on the show. What we're going on about here is actually more support to the likes of the private sector that is hastening electrification on the continent and in Rwanda. What other support mechanisms can we actually pull out of the bag here?
There are very many different types of support mechanisms, some which can be done in the country, maybe by your own budget alone with some direct support, and I would like to come back to that later. Some which would get channeled from the international donor institutions like ADB or like the German or the French agencies, financing institutions who are paid for to do that job. And what I mean is, the problem there is only for them often this microgrid or off-grid solutions is very small amount of money in the package or the portfolio they have. So they cannot deal with it. To bring it down to the one village, it would be really inefficient. But what can be done is to take on more the idea, which is in your country also well established, in the cooperative idea of a village. And that this cooperative does a certain, I'm not so much a fan that everything should be paid for me. I'm more, you have to be responsible for your own life, and you have to be responsible for access to services. Also, you produce them often themselves, and I agree with you, after 3 or 5 years, when it's then really yours, you get electricity basically for zero, for that what you had invested. And that investment, if you would make publicity to have more village or rural savings and loan mechanisms, which are established in many other things, buying goats or buying, there are good examples. If you concentrate these examples of enabling a village or a community to have their own cooperative, and then to go and ask you for your service and say, look here, we will buy that now. And then you say, okay, there's the missing link. And then you could have a business model, if I may say, you have not that one village, but you may have 10 or 20. So you aggregate the sum, the total sum, and with that aggregation, if you would go with that then to a finance institution, and if that could be then bundled by the state agency, you will get that money and it comes back to, so there is a cooperative model which I'm always fond of, and talking the off-grid solution, I could even imagine by that, when the access to financing does not mean one of you in the chain has to have 18% interest rate to pay, which is just making it too expensive. But if you keep it in this more reasonable way, where even there may be a benefit from the investment into that cooperative, maybe just 3%, but more than nothing, no? Then you create a complete different wealth model here. And that is a challenge. If I may say, we may have probably a luxury discussion in Europe or in my country. We have now 30% or 31% renewable electricity in Germany all over, which is a lot. Our grid becomes even more stable and more stable, which people, that's a side answer from previous discussion tonight. But we have more and more people. It's like it's no longer chic to have a Mercedes. It's rather chic not to have a driver license, but to have this running around you whatever, and you have at home, you have your own electricity supply if it's your own roof, and we have tenant law, now tenant model, where the tenants can put things together. And now the grid has a problem, because the grid said, if that's going on with all these communities investing in farms and consuming it the same time on the spot and only giving or taking the ads, then my grid refinancing becomes difficult, because then in the end I end up to serve those who are not clever enough. I make it now a bit. So we are talking now about flat rates for grid use.
That's a very fascinating conversation indeed. I think opposite to that is energy subsidies that we are seeing in much of Sub-Saharan Africa. And Dr. Ivan, how worried are you about, in a bid to achieve 100% access to electricity in Rwanda, how worried are you about maybe energy subsidies in the country going up?
Before going to subsidy, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of forming cooperatives. And show a little bit the weakness people who are in off-grid are facing in terms of raising financing. When you are on-grid, you sign a power purchase agreement with the utility. Only that contract in its own, it's a security for you vis-a-vis banks and institutions who can give you money. For the off-grid people, there is no government institution between them and the population. They have to deal with the population house by house without any security that these people will pay. If you bring 100 houses contract, only 100 houses contract to a bank, you will not be able to raise a lot of money to do your project. So this is also another challenge they are getting, which we have to address. In Rwanda, they committed because of an enabling environment created by the government and trust. Because, as you know, the population pay using mobile money on a monthly basis. But you don't have any other security from this client. So this is something also special, which can't run in any country. Because people will grab those tools and then they will disappear and you will lose all your investment.
But isn't
that's also a weakness? It's
isn't
a
that risk justification enough for off-grid solutions being relatively more expensive than on-grid solutions?
I mean, looking at the risk, yes, 50-50, I would say. But again, what Ivan just said, we are business people, but we also, the environment matters a lot. If the environment is welcoming and at least reassuring, then you have to try and trust the opening environment. But yes, when you look at the risks, I mean, increases the cost. But again, it's a changing market. Things are changing and taking, yeah.
Dr.
So coming back to the subsidy question, I think this is a formula which you can apply in a country where corruption and favoritism is put aside. As if those two parameters are still on, even those subsidies will not bring a solution. In Rwanda, we made an option to put classes. We have Ubudehe 1, Ubudehe 2, 3, and 4. 4 classes, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Those subsidy programs will mainly address Tier 1. Those people who are not able to afford even a 3-lamp system. So if the government has a target to give electricity to all the population, 100% by 2024, it was very important also to address this issue of people who are not able to pay even a small system. Those people who today are not able to get access to mutuel, the insurance, medical insurance. If we were able to do that on medical insurance, to make sure that all the population needs to have access to medical insurance, so we needed also to find an option for the subsidy. Rwanda created what we call an energy development fund. We have $50 million in that basket to come as subsidy. And the subsidy mainly will go to the companies straightforward. After justifying that, they give electricity to this number of population, but classified in Tier 1.
Right. I want to bring you in, Dr. Dotze, on this one, because I think it was last year, one of the biggest concerns for the International Monetary Fund was, at least for Sub-Saharan Africa and much of the developing countries, was the fact that energy subsidies were going up. To some countries, energy subsidies had reached close to 10% of GDP. Now, this is, if you add that to the fiscal deficit of a country, to the current account deficit, you're north of close to 30%, which is definitely worrying. With your experience in this field, how should this be addressed going forward, especially if countries are looking at electrification? Is this a trade-off that can be accepted? Should you accept subsidies until maybe you're at 80% electrification? What is the trade-off here?
Yeah, the energy price subsidization is complicated because sometimes it's a hidden social aid program, meaning you want to keep the electricity. Some countries come and say, at all costs, we keep the electricity price at a certain level because we know our GDP, we know how it is. If that is discussed openly, that's fine, but that is not really an energy subsidy. It's a certain provision you give to the population that it's not too burdened by the access to electricity. But often it's more like an indirect tax relief, if I may say so. So that's a political issue very often in some countries. We have seen that when all of a sudden petrol prices or energy prices went up, even in oil-producing countries, you create havoc. So that is the one thing. The subsidies we are talking of, like in many countries, a feed-in tariff, for example, for the producer of electricity who sells it to the grid, and he gets at least a guaranteed price in order to finance his investment. That's a different type of subsidy. And the same, I would say, in this electrification, it's an infrastructure mechanism to modernize, in this case, a rural area. So it needs to be there as long as you have a balanced electrification, I would say. You should not shy away, because we're talking I don't think we are talking a lot about a huge amount of money. We are talking about a stabilizing amount of money in a situation where access to finance, again, when there's 18% to be paid to a private finance sector, people cannot use that. So the state comes in and gives a certain relief in order to finance, in order to get it going. So for me, it's a transition payment which has to be there, like as you were talking about healthcare support by the government, where you pay sometimes something yourself and the rest is paid by an insurance, and something for poor people is paid to this insurance by the state. But that's the welfare state. That's what we want. That's why we had the French Revolution.
It's very interesting you actually bring that in, and I want to bring Patrick into the conversation here, because if at all solar is cardinal to the conversation around off-grid solutions, I know there's already existing subsidies and incentives to actually push companies like Mobisol that are hastening, should I say, the process of electrification using solar and off-grid solutions. Shouldn't maybe more be being done, maybe more subsidies on the solar side? Again, I'm remaining on the subsidy end, but this time maybe on the solar front.
Definitely. I mean, being Mobisol, being even other players on the market, this is what we're looking for, and this is what we expect. We were having a conversation in regards World Bank project coming up, and looking forward to where they will actually materialize at some point. But also the government on its own. Today, Ivan was talking about Tier 1 and Tier 2, and these are the people, Tier 1, for example, who are really poor. And so in the eyes of the government, they will be like, okay, we need to provide energy for this category, and we actually have to buy solar home system and distribute them for free. You see, it's a good gesture, and it's very good coming from the government. But on the other side, it also deteriorates the market in terms of the private sector, because we are here also to operate, and those people are actually part of our target, of our market niche. So this is why we also insist that we sit together with the government, come up with those solutions, see ways they can subsidize these products for this specific market. And I want to take you on a very good point you make. It's very important that someone pays something for such investment, because you give it value, and you actually maintain it, and use it the way it should be used. It's not good that someone also always pay for everything for you. So it's good. We're hoping to have kind of partnership with the government, and then push this forward.
I have to ask you about legislation. We've seen some countries, I'm Ugandan myself, and Uganda did sign a terrible deal, energy deal with another company, I won't mention it, and it's close to over 25 years. Terrible, terrible deal. And in your line of work, how hard is it? I want to ask you both here. How essential is it to get the legislation right, let alone the concession agreements? Because this can actually be a cost that your grandchildren get to pay in the grand scheme of things. Let me start with you, Dr. Dorte.
It's essential. It's the backbone for energy transformation, that you have legislation in place which is reliable, which is transparent, and which gives security. And you were talking now, the old legacy approach in centralized energy supply from the past was often combined, and in some countries obviously is, with long-term contracts. And these long-term contracts in the European Union, for example, when we were opening towards an energy market, we put a stop to this long-term contracts.
So how long do you sign now?
So the government nowadays should not sign long-term contracts to one company, at least without previous tendering and procurement systems, for longer than, I would say, 10 years. It's on average now. And if you have to have, because you have stranded commitments from the past, you need it as a country. I remember some countries, like Portugal, had to do that, notify to the European Commission. So there is a body supervising access, let's say. On the other hand, in renewables, you have to see that renewables have, apart from some types like biomass, have next to no operating costs, but they have all the costs up front. So the payment schedule now, as you said, is mostly linked to the expected lifetime to make it in a balanced way, so between 15 and 25 years on average. And that needs to be in place, and it needs to be comforted by legislation. And also the support mechanisms which you install, like feed-in mechanism, have to be reviewed regularly with scientists, with stakeholders, because you have to be fast enough to hit the right tariff. We, for example, in Germany, we made a mistake in the past, which we as electricity users still pay a little bit more, because we always review every 2 years at least, but even though the PV price at one time remained too high, even though the technology costs were already drastically going down when China came in with own production at a large scale. So you cannot say I make a feed-in law now, or a premium, or whatever you call that beauty, and then in 10 years I look at it. No, it's constant. You have constantly to adapt it to reality.
Yeah, that's very important, reviewing it. Dr. Ivan, I want to bring you in on this one.
In Africa, it's completely different. It's virgin. In most of the countries, there is no registration, especially in energy sector. In Rwanda, on the last 5 years, it was also the case. As I told you, we had to participate in the rural electrification strategy, and it was approved last year. But solar companies were already on the market. We participated in the feed-in tariff, to fix the feed-in tariff through the regulatory body. And to cut short, the success in Africa to have proper registration addressing the issues and all the stakeholders, you need to have private sector in the drafting of those registrations.
From the beginning.
From the beginning, because if you don't involve them, the people who are on the public side, they will not be in the shoes to think for private sector because they have been never involved in private sector. So how can you ask them to think like someone who is protecting private sector where they don't even know the practice and what is going on there? So we have an opportunity, it's still virgin. Then let's start and involve all the people, and we put in place registration coming really serving all the people involved in a sector.
I can see you, Patrick, you're itching to just add to that, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Patrick Mugabo at my extreme left, just across me with Mobisol, Dr. Dr. Fouquet and Dr. Ivan Tuagashima. Many thanks for making time to speak to us. A panel here, star-studded panel without any exception here, talking about energy across Rwanda, sustainable energy. And of course, Rwanda has made a target for 2024 to achieve universal electrification. That is 100% electrification, off-grid and on-grid, both coming to the table. That's where we'll leave it for the CNBC Africa special. I'm Arnold Sagawa. This is CNBC Africa First in Business Worldwide.